The alarm on my console screamed before I had even finished my morning ration, and I knew, the way you know when the air pressure drops before a storm, that something had gone wrong on a scale we were not prepared for. My name is Talus Kor, and I have served in the Coalition fleet for 11 cycles, long enough to recognize the difference between a drill and a disaster. This was not a drill. The report came from the outer settlements near the Varan Belt, a quiet mining region that had never seen conflict in my lifetime. The Skarn Dominion had broken through our defensive line there, and 3 colonies had gone silent within a single rotation. Not damaged, not evacuated. Silent, the way a room goes silent when every voice in it has been taken away at once. I was stationed aboard the Coalition cruiser, Aveline Spire, a mid-sized vessel, crewed by 6 different species, and I remember standing on the bridge as the reports kept arriving, each one worse than the last. Commander Petra Solin, my superior, a sharp-eyed human transplant who had lived among our people longer than most humans lived anywhere outside their own territory, read the casualty figures aloud in a voice that did not shake, though her hands did. I want to explain something before I go further, because you will not understand what came later unless you understand what came before. The galaxy I grew up in had an order to it. Species fought, yes. Borders shifted, alliances broke and reformed, and the Skarn Dominion had been chewing through the outer rim for nearly a decade before that day. But there were rules, unspoken ones, agreed upon by every civilized species that had ever built a fleet. You did not target undefended worlds without warning. You did not erase a settlement simply because it was convenient. The Skarn had always followed those rules. Poorly, reluctantly, but they followed them. That day, they stopped following them. We received a distress signal from Varan Colony 4, a farming settlement of perhaps 12,000 souls, mostly Threll and a smaller population of Ashkar traders. The signal cut off midway through a sentence. I still remember the last words that made it through the static, spoken by a voice too calm for what was happening around it. They are not stopping. They are not taking prisoners. They are not leaving anything behind. By the time our fleet arrived, there was nothing left to defend. I will not describe what we found. I will only say that after that day, every officer aboard the Aveline Spire understood that the war had changed shape, and none of us knew what shape it had become. The Coalition Council convened an emergency session 2 days later, and for the first time in my career, I was permitted to observe the proceedings from the officers' gallery. Representatives from 11 member species argued for hours about strategy, about reinforcements, about whether to pull back our lines or hold them. Admiral Corwin Vale, the ranking coalition officer for our sector, stood before the council with a report that painted a grim picture. The Skarn Dominion had tripled its production capacity in the last 2 years. Our shipyards could not match their pace. Our best pilots were dying faster than we could train new ones. At the current rate of loss, the council's own analysts projected that the coalition's outer territories would fall within 18 months, and the core worlds within 5 years after that. It was during this session that someone, I do not remember who, first spoke the word that made the entire chamber go quiet. Terrans. I had heard the word before, of course. Every species in the galaxy had heard it, the way children hear the name of a monster in a story, told to keep them from wandering too far from home. The Terrans, or humans as they called themselves, occupied a small, heavily guarded stretch of territory on the far edge of known space, sealed off by a treaty that predated my grandparents. Nobody crossed into that territory. Nobody invited them out of it. The treaty was old, older than most of the governments that still honored it, and the reasons behind it were rarely discussed in polite company. What I knew of humans came from fragments, historical records that had been redacted so thoroughly that entire decades were missing. Stories passed between old soldiers who claimed to have served during the last contact incident, though none of them agreed on the details, and the phrase, repeated in classrooms across a dozen species, meant to teach caution rather than fear, though it always sounded like fear to me. Never wake the sleepers. Counselor Yeshin Dara, an elder of the Ashkar delegation, was the one who finally said aloud what everyone in that chamber had been thinking and refusing to voice. She stood, her 4 eyes fixed on Admiral Vale, and asked a question that hung in the recycled air like smoke. If we are going to lose this war within a generation, does it matter what the cost of survival is? The chamber erupted into argument. Some delegates insisted that whatever the treaty had been designed to prevent was still a greater danger than the Skarn Dominion. Others argued that a species capable of demanding such an extreme and permanent quarantine must possess capabilities that could turn the tide of any war, and that our pride and old fears were not worth the price of extinction. I watched Commander Solon during this exchange, and I noticed something I had never seen in her before. She looked afraid, not of the Skarn, but of the conversation happening in front of her. I asked her about it later, once the session had ended, and the council had agreed to nothing except to reconvene the following week. We sat together in the officers' mess, and she turned her cup of tea slowly between her hands before she answered me. "You people tell stories about us like we are ghosts," she said. "Like we are something from before your grandparents were born, something locked away because we were too dangerous to look at directly. And maybe that is true. I do not know all of it. Humanity does not talk about that time either, not even among ourselves. But I know this much. If the council calls, and if my people answer, you will understand something about my species that no story could have prepared you for." I asked her what that was. She looked at me for a long moment before she spoke again. "We do not measure cost the way you do, Talus. We never have. That is the entire reason the treaty exists." I did not sleep well that night, and I do not think anyone aboard the Aveline Spire did either. Word of the council session had spread through the fleet within hours, distorted and exaggerated the way rumors always are, and by morning, half the crew believed the humans were already on their way, while the other half insisted the treaty could never be broken, not even now, not even facing extinction. The council reconvened 4 days later, earlier than scheduled, because the Skarn Dominion had struck again, this time at a shipyard that supplied nearly a third of our fleet's replacement vessels. The attack came without warning, without demand, without the customary exchange of grievances that had at least given the illusion of a war fought between civilized powers. It was simply erasure, delivered with mechanical patience. I was not present for that second session, but Commander Solon told me afterward that the vote had been close, closer than anyone expected given the desperation in the room. In the end, it was not fear of the Skarn that decided it. It was arithmetic. The Coalition's own projections left no room for pride. The Council authorized the activation of an emergency beacon, a device so old that half the engineers on the flagship had never seen its schematics before that week, built for exactly one purpose: to call the sleepers and hope they still remembered how to answer. I watched the beacon activate from the observation deck of the Aveline Spire, though there was nothing to see, no visible light, no dramatic flare across the void. Just a technician confirming a transmission had gone out, aimed at coordinates that had not been used in longer than any living member of the crew had been alive. Then we waited. Nothing happened for 3 weeks. During that time, the Skarn Dominion did not slow down. 2 more settlements fell in the outer rim, and a third barely survived thanks to a coalition strike force that arrived with minutes to spare, and paid for those minutes with more than half its ships. I stood watch during several of those engagements, monitoring communications, relaying orders, watching names disappear from the fleet roster one by one. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from losing a war slowly, where you can see the end coming, and can do nothing but delay it, and by the 3rd week, I felt that exhaustion settle into my bones like frost. Commander Solon grew quieter as the days passed, though I noticed she checked the long-range sensor logs more often than her duties required. When I asked her why, she told me that if her people answered the call, there would be no dramatic announcement, no formal declaration broadcast across every channel in the sector. There would simply be a signature on the sensors, one day, where there had been nothing the day before. On the 22nd day, that is exactly what happened. I was on the bridge when the sensor officer, a young thrall named Avrin Tass, called out in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence. "Contact. Single vessel. Crossing the treaty boundary now." The bridge went silent in a way I can only compare to the silence after the Varan colony transmission cut out, except this silence was not filled with dread. It was filled with something closer to disbelief, the kind of stillness that comes when a story you were told as a child suddenly steps out of the page and into the room with you. Commander Solon moved to the sensor station herself, and I watched her study the readings for a long moment before she spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "1 ship," she confirmed. No escort, no formation, just one. I asked her, because I could not help myself, whether that was normal. Whether her people always sent a single vessel to answer a call for a war that threatened to end an entire alliance of species. She did not answer right away. When she finally did, she said something I have thought about many times since. That single ship is not a scout, Talus. It is not a diplomat, and it is not a warning shot. If humanity sent one ship in answer to that beacon, it means one ship is what the Council's own experts believed would be necessary. And enough. The vessel's approach vector was calculated and confirmed over the following hours, and word spread through every ship in the fleet, faster than any official channel could manage. By the time the human vessel entered visual range of the rally point near the Coalition's forward staging area, nearly every off-duty crew member on the Aveline Spire had crowded into the observation lounges, myself included, pressed against the viewports like children waiting for a festival procession. What we saw defied easy description. The vessel was smaller than I expected, sleeker than the boxy utilitarian designs favored by most Coalition shipyards. Its hull, a dark matte surface that seemed to swallow the starlight around it, rather than reflect it. It approached without the customary blinking of running lights, without any of the identification beacons that every civilized vessel broadcast as a courtesy. It simply moved through space, with a kind of quiet certainty, as though it had never once considered the possibility that anyone might question its right to be there. Ovrentas, still monitoring the sensors, called out readings that made no sense to any of us. Propulsion signature does not match known physics models. Power output is fluctuating in a pattern the computer cannot classify. Hull composition, unknown. Commander Solon, standing beside me now, allowed herself the faintest smile, though her eyes never left the viewport. "That is because it should not work," she said quietly. "And it does anyway. That is rather the point of my people, Talus." We stopped waiting for permission from physics a long time ago. The human vessel broadcast a single transmission as it settled into formation near our staging fleet. No fanfare, no lengthy greeting, just a designation and a set of coordinates confirming its arrival. The voice that delivered it was calm, almost bored, entirely unbothered by the fact that it was addressing an alliance of 11 species that had spent 3 weeks holding its collective breath. "This is the Halcyon, responding to Coalition distress signal, designation 714, requesting docking coordinates and a briefing on current tactical situation." That was all. No declaration of purpose, no acknowledgement of the historic weight of the moment, nothing that suggested the speaker understood or cared that an entire fleet had just watched a myth become a fact in front of their eyes. I remember looking at Commander Solon and asking her, half in awe and half in something closer to unease, whether this was truly what her people were like. She looked out at the ship, floating silent and dark against the stars, and her answer was simple, though I did not fully understand it until much later. "This," she said, "is what we are like when we are being polite." I did not know, standing there in that crowded observation lounge with my crewmates murmuring around me in 6 different languages, that the arrival of that single vessel was only the first page of a much longer story. I did not know that the calm voice which had spoken so briefly over the comm channel belonged to a man who would change how I understood the word cost, or that the Coalition I had served my entire adult life was about to learn the true difference between fighting a war and ending one. I only knew that the sleepers, whatever they truly were, had woken, and that nothing in the galaxy would look quite the same again. Docking procedures for the Halcyon took less time than any arrival I had witnessed in 11 cycles of service. Where most Allied vessels required an exchange of credentials, a review of cargo manifests, and at least an hour of diplomatic courtesies before clearance was granted, the human ship simply matched velocity with the Aveline Spire, extended a boarding tube that our engineers had never seen the design for, and waited. Commander Solon was assigned to lead the welcoming party, and because of my long service record and my growing fascination with everything I had witnessed so far, she requested that I join her. I stood beside her at the airlock as the boarding tube pressurized, and I noticed that none of the usual ceremony had been arranged. No honor guard, no formal greeting delegation from the Council, none of the pageantry that typically accompanied a first meeting between Allied powers. When I asked Commander Solon about this, she told me that a large gathering would have been the wrong choice entirely, though she did not explain why until later. The airlock door slid open, and the first human I had ever seen in person stepped through it without hesitation, as though he had walked through that exact doorway 100 times before. He was of average height, though something about the way he carried himself made him seem larger, a stillness in his posture that reminded me more of a predator at rest than a soldier at attention. His hair was a dark brown, cropped short, and his eyes moved across the corridor and the small gathering of officers with the quick, thorough assessment of someone cataloging every possible exit and threat in the space of a single breath. He introduced himself as Ethan Cole, captain of the Halcyon, and his handshake, when he offered it to Commander Solon, was firm but unremarkable. I had expected, foolishly perhaps, that a human capable of crossing a treaty boundary alone to answer a call that terrified an entire alliance would radiate some visible aura of danger. Instead, he simply looked tired, the way any officer looks after a long journey, and mildly amused by the number of eyes fixed on him. "You can stop staring," he said, addressing the small crowd of officers gathered near the airlock without raising his voice. "I promise I am not going to do anything interesting standing here." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the group, though I noticed most of it came from species unfamiliar enough with human behavior that they were unsure whether the comment was meant as a joke or a warning. Commander Solon, for her part, smiled with the easy familiarity of someone greeting an old colleague rather than a legend given flesh, and led him toward the briefing room where Admiral Vale and the rest of the senior staff were waiting. I was permitted to attend the briefing as an aide, mostly because Commander Solon insisted my sensor analysis experience would be useful, though I suspect she also wanted a witness she trusted at her side. Admiral Vale opened the meeting with a summary of our current losses, and I watched Captain Cole listen without interruption, his expression unreadable, occasionally glancing at a data slate that displayed the Coalition's tactical maps. When the Admiral finished, Captain Cole asked only a handful of questions, each one precise and stripped of any unnecessary courtesy. He wanted to know the Skarn Dominion's typical fleet composition, their command structure, whether they operated on a centralized hive intelligence or distributed authority, and what weapons systems the Coalition had already tested against them without success. Admiral Vale answered each question honestly, though I noticed a flicker of discomfort cross his face at how quickly the human captain moved past the emotional weight of our losses and directly into operational assessment. "Forgive me for asking directly," Admiral Vale said eventually, "but the Council authorized a full request for aid. We expected, or perhaps hoped, that a response of this magnitude would arrive with a larger commitment of forces. A single vessel, however capable, seems a modest answer to a war of this scale." Captain Cole's expression did not change, but something in his tone shifted, just slightly, into a register that made the hair along my scalp ridge rise, without my understanding why. "The Halcyon is not the response," he said. "It is the assessment. My government does not commit resources to a conflict until someone has personally verified what that conflict actually requires. I am here to determine that. Once I have, you will understand that a modest response was never the plan." The room went quiet again, and I found myself studying the captain more closely, trying to reconcile the calm, almost bureaucratic manner of his speech with the enormity of what he had just implied. Commander Solon caught my eye across the table and gave the faintest shake of her head, a silent signal that I should not ask the question forming on my tongue, though I did not fully understand her caution until later that evening. After the briefing concluded, Captain Cole requested a tour of the Aveline Spire's tactical systems, and Commander Solon assigned me to accompany him, citing my technical background. I spent nearly 3 hours walking beside him through engineering, weapons control, and the fleet coordination deck, and during that time I learned more about human behavior than every historical record I had ever studied combined. He was, above all else, disarmingly ordinary in conversation. He asked about my homeworld, a temperate system 3 jumps from the Coalition's core territory, and listened with genuine interest as I described the seasonal migrations that shaped Threll culture. He laughed, a short, easy sound, when I admitted that I had been terrified to meet him, and told me that most people were, though he seemed more amused by the fact than offended. It was during a discussion about our shield technology, as we stood in the weapons control room reviewing schematics, that the conversation turned toward something darker, and I finally understood the unease that Commander Solon carried whenever the subject of her own people arose. I had asked him, carefully, why humanity maintained such strict isolation, why an entire species would agree to seal itself away behind a treaty rather than participate in the wider galactic community. He was quiet for a moment, studying the schematic in front of him rather than looking at me, and when he answered, his voice had lost its earlier warmth, replaced by something flatter, more deliberate. "We did not isolate ourselves because we were ashamed," he said. "We did it because early in our history, before most of your species had even discovered radio communication, we made contact with an aggressive power that believed conquest was simply the natural order of things. They attacked our colonies the way the Skarn Dominion is attacking yours now, without warning, without room for negotiation. And when we finished dealing with that threat, several of our own allies at the time decided that the way we had dealt with it made us more dangerous than the threat itself." I asked him, though I already suspected I did not want the answer, what exactly his people had done. He looked at me then, and there was no cruelty in his expression, no satisfaction, only a tired kind of honesty that made the answer somehow worse than if he had gloated. "We ended it," he said simply. "Completely. And once it was over, we realized that ending threats that thoroughly was something we were disturbingly good at, and something the rest of the galaxy was not prepared to witness up close on a regular basis. The treaty was not a punishment. It was a mutual agreement, because everyone involved, including us, decided it was safer for the galaxy if we only came out when we were needed, rather than whenever we felt like it." I did not know how to respond to that, and he seemed to sense my discomfort, because his tone softened again, returning to the easy, almost casual manner he had carried since stepping aboard. "Do not misunderstand me," he added. "We are not monsters looking for an excuse. We do not want this war any more than you do. But your council called, and the situation you described in that briefing is not something that responds well to caution. The Skarn Dominion is not negotiating. It is not slowing down. It will not stop because you ask it to, or because you offer concessions, or because you fight it fairly. It will only stop when it concludes that continuing costs more than it is willing to pay. That is the only language a threat like this understands, and unfortunately, it happens to be the language my people speak best." I spent that night unable to sleep, replaying the conversation over and over, trying to decide whether I had just spoken with a hero or something far more complicated. Commander Solon found me in the officers' mess long after most of the crew had retired, and she sat across from me without a word for a long moment before speaking. "He told you the story," she said. It was not a question. I admitted that he had, and asked her whether it was true, whether an entire species had truly ended an ancient threat, so completely that the rest of the galaxy felt compelled to lock them away, out of fear rather than gratitude. She considered the question carefully before answering, turning her cup between her hands the way she had during our first conversation about her people, weeks earlier. "It is true," she said. "But you are thinking about it the wrong way, Talus. You are imagining monsters. What you actually spoke to today was a man who has spent his entire adult life carrying the knowledge of what his species is capable of, and choosing, every single day, not to use that capability unless there is truly no other option left. That restraint is the real story. The ending of that ancient threat is simply the reason the rest of the galaxy never gave humanity the chance to prove it." I asked her what she thought would happen now that the Skarn Dominion, a threat that had already proven itself willing to erase entire colonies without warning, was about to meet a species that specialized in ending threats completely. She looked toward the viewport, where the dark silhouette of the Halcyon still floated alongside our fleet, patient and silent against the stars, and her answer settled into my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "I think," she said quietly, "that the Skarn Dominion made a mistake it does not yet understand it made. And I think, very soon, all of us are going to watch exactly what that mistake costs them." 2 days later, the Coalition received intelligence that a Skarn strike fleet was advancing toward a supply depot along our forward line, a target that, if lost, would cripple our ability to resupply nearly a third of the fleet. Admiral Vale convened an emergency strategy session, and for the first time since his arrival, Captain Cole did not simply observe and ask questions. He stood, studied the tactical display for a long moment, and spoke with a certainty that left no room for debate. "I will handle the depot," he said. "Keep your fleet at the secondary rally point and monitor." I do not need reinforcements for this, and frankly, I would prefer the room. Admiral Vale hesitated, glancing at Commander Solon, as though seeking confirmation that this was truly the correct course of action, and she gave a small, resigned nod, the expression of someone who had seen this exact scene play out before, in stories if nowhere else. "Let him go," she said. "This is what he came here to do." I requested, and was granted, permission to observe the engagement from the Aveline Spire's forward sensor array, though nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I was about to witness. As the Halcyon broke formation and moved alone toward the approaching Skarn fleet, I found myself gripping the edge of the console, caught somewhere between dread and an emotion I did not yet have a word for, something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. The supply depot sat near a cluster of asteroid fields at the edge of the forward line, a sprawling structure of docking rings and fuel processors that had taken the Coalition nearly a decade to build. 12,000 workers lived and served aboard it, most of them civilians who kept the fleet running with parts and provisions that could not be manufactured fast enough anywhere closer to the front. Losing it would not just cripple our logistics. It would mean 12,000 more names added to a list that had already grown far too long. I watched the sensor feed from the Aveline Spire as the Skarn fleet came into range, a formation of 18 vessels moving with the eerie, synchronized precision that had become their signature, every ship adjusting its course in perfect unison as though controlled by a single mind rather than 18 separate crews. That uniformity was part of what made them so difficult to fight. They did not hesitate, did not second-guess an order, did not break formation out of fear the way individual crews sometimes did under pressure. They simply advanced, methodical and patient, the way a tide advances on a shoreline that has already given up trying to hold it back. The Halcyon approached from an oblique angle, and I noticed immediately that Captain Cole was not following any tactical doctrine I recognized. Coalition strategy, drilled into every pilot from their first year of training, emphasized coordinated formations, mutual shield support, and calculated retreats when engagement became too costly. The Halcyon did none of this. It moved alone, without formation, without any apparent concern for the numerical disadvantage displayed plainly on every screen in front of me. Avran Tass, monitoring alongside me, whispered something I did not quite catch, though I understood the sentiment behind it without needing the words. We were both watching a single ship approach 18, and every instinct built by years of Coalition training told us this should already be over, should already have ended with the destruction of the smaller force before it even came within effective firing range. The Skarn fleet opened the engagement first, their weapon systems firing in the same coordinated bursts that had shredded Coalition formations for years. Concentrated fire, designed to overwhelm shields through sheer accumulated force rather than precision. I braced myself for what I expected to see next, the bright flare of a shield collapsing, the slow tumble of a disabled vessel drifting into the dark. It did not come. The Halcyon moved through the incoming fire in a pattern that seemed almost lazy, unhurried, each shift in trajectory placing it just fractionally outside the concentration of enemy fire, as though the ship's pilot had already calculated every possible firing solution the Skarn fleet could generate, and was simply choosing, moment by moment, not to be where the danger was. Then the Halcyon returned fire, and I understood, in that instant, why Commander Solon had spoken of restraint, the way one speaks of a dam holding back a flood. I will not describe the details of the weapons systems the Halcyon employed, because I do not believe I fully understood them myself, and because the specifics matter less than what I witnessed as a result. 2 Skarn vessels lost power within seconds of the first exchange, their shields failing not gradually but all at once, as though something had reached inside their systems and simply switched them off. A third vessel attempted an evasive maneuver and found itself, impossibly, exactly where the Halcyon's next strike was already waiting. The Skarn Dominion's hive command structure, as Captain Cole had asked about during the earlier briefing, relied on a shared tactical awareness that allowed every vessel in a formation to react to a developing threat almost instantaneously, adjusting as one organism, rather than 18 separate crews making 18 separate decisions. I watched that unified response falter for the first time in any engagement I had ever observed, the remaining Skarn vessels breaking formation, scattering in a way that suggested confusion, rather than tactical calculation. Commander Solon, standing beside me now with her arms folded tightly across her chest, spoke quietly, almost to herself. "They do not know what they are looking at," she said. "Their entire strategy depends on predicting an opponent's reactions. He is not reacting to them. He already knows what they are going to do before they do it." I asked her how that was possible, and she admitted, honestly, that she did not know the full technical explanation, only that human tactical systems had always operated on principles the rest of the galaxy struggled to replicate, something about processing speed and predictive modeling that went beyond what our own engineers had ever managed to build. I remember hoping, in that moment, that we would never need to understand it fully, and simultaneously feeling an overwhelming gratitude that it existed at all. The engagement lasted less than 11 minutes from the first exchange of fire to the moment the remaining Skarn vessels attempted a coordinated retreat. I watched the Halcyon pursue only long enough to disable their propulsion systems rather than destroy them outright, a choice that confused me, until Commander Solon explained, later, that Captain Cole had likely wanted survivors, wanted a record of what had happened here to reach the Dominion's command structure intact, a message delivered through witnesses rather than silence. When the engagement ended, 12 of the 18 Skarn vessels drifted disabled but largely intact. The remaining 6 had suffered damage severe enough that their crews would not survive without immediate evacuation, though the depot's own rescue shuttles, I later learned, were dispatched to retrieve them regardless, an order that came directly from Captain Cole himself, relayed through the depot's communication officer with the same flat, unbothered tone he had used throughout the briefing days earlier. I did not understand that decision at the time. I asked Commander Solon why a species capable of ending threats as thoroughly as humanity clearly could would choose to save the lives of an enemy that had shown coalition worlds no such mercy. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. "Because cruelty was never the point, Talus," she said. "My people do not fight to make an enemy suffer. We fight to make a threat stop, and the moment it has stopped, the reason for violence stops with it. That distinction matters more than you understand right now, but I promise you, it matters more than almost anything else about us." The depot's 12,000 workers survived the engagement without a single casualty, and word of the battle spread through the coalition fleet within hours, distorted and amplified the way such stories always are, until by the following day, nearly every crew member across a dozen ships had heard some version of the story, each more dramatic than the last. I found myself in the unusual position of being one of the few people who had actually witnessed the engagement directly, and I spent the next several days answering questions from crewmates who wanted to know, desperately, whether the stories were true. I told them the truth as I understood it, though I found the truth difficult to fully articulate. It was not simply that the Halcyon had won an impossible battle against overwhelming numbers. It was the manner in which it had won, the calm, unhurried precision that suggested the entire engagement had never truly been in doubt from the human perspective, that the numerical disadvantage which should have guaranteed defeat by every coalition tactical model had simply never been a factor in the outcome at all. Admiral Vale requested a full debrief from Captain Cole once the Halcyon returned to the fleet's staging area, and I was again permitted to attend as an aide to Commander Solon, though I suspect by this point she had simply decided to bring me along as a witness regardless of official justification. The briefing room was more crowded than it had been during the first meeting, word having spread enough that several other coalition officers had requested attendance, eager to hear the human captain's own account of the engagement. Captain Cole, however, seemed almost uninterested in discussing the battle itself, treating it with the same clinical brevity he had applied to every previous conversation. When Admiral Vale asked him to walk the room through his tactical decisions, he offered a summary that lasted less than 5 minutes, focused entirely on practical details, propulsion signatures he had identified as exploitable, communication patterns within the Skarn formation that suggested a centralized command node rather than a truly distributed hive intelligence, weaknesses that the Coalition's own tacticians could study and apply to future engagements. It was only when Admiral Vale pressed him further, asking directly how confident he had felt entering an engagement against 18 vessels alone, that Captain Cole's expression shifted into something more thoughtful, and his answer, when it came, silenced the room more effectively than any tactical summary could have. "Confidence was never really the question," he said. I already knew the outcome before I engaged. The only real question was how much of it I was willing to let them see. I could have ended that engagement in under a minute if I had wanted to. I chose not to, because your council needs allies who understand exactly what my people are capable of, and the Skarn Dominion needs to understand it too, clearly enough that they consider, even briefly, whether continuing this war is truly worth what it will now cost them. Admiral Vale asked, carefully, whether Captain Cole believed the Dominion would actually reconsider its campaign based on a single engagement, however decisive. Captain Cole was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, there was no arrogance in his voice, only a tired certainty that had clearly been earned through experience rather than assumption. No, he said simply, not yet. This was one ship, one battle, a message rather than an ending. They will need to see more before they truly understand what has changed, and unfortunately, I do not believe they will choose to understand it peacefully. I believe they will escalate first, the way most threats do when they first realize the balance has shifted against them. That is when the real cost of this war will be decided, not today. I remember the silence that followed his words, a silence filled not with relief, as I might have expected after witnessing such a decisive victory, but with a dawning understanding that the war we had been fighting for years, the desperate, grinding conflict that had already cost so many lives, was about to enter a phase none of us had ever prepared for, one where the outcome was no longer truly in doubt, but where the price of reaching that outcome remained entirely unwritten. Captain Cole's prediction proved accurate within the week. Coalition intelligence, gathered through a network of listening posts scattered along the contested border, detected a massive buildup of Skarn Dominion forces near a system called Halvorn, a strategic choke point that controlled access to nearly a quarter of the Coalition's remaining core territory. Admiral Vale called it the largest single fleet concentration the Dominion had ever assembled, more than 200 vessels, a number that made the earlier engagement at the supply depot look like a minor skirmish by comparison. I was reassigned during this period to serve as a liaison aboard the Halcyon itself, a decision made jointly by Commander Solon and Captain Cole after the depot engagement, ostensibly so that Coalition Command could maintain direct communication with the human vessel during upcoming operations. I suspected, though I never confirmed it, that Commander Solon had also arranged the assignment, because she believed someone from the Coalition needed to witness what was coming firsthand, someone who could carry an honest account back to the fleet, rather than relying on second-hand reports and exaggerated rumors. The interior of the Halcyon defied my expectations in almost every way. I had imagined, based on the ship's imposing reputation, something stark and militaristic, corridors lined with weapons and warning displays. Instead, I found a vessel that felt strangely lived in, personal touches scattered throughout the crew areas, a small collection of plants growing under artificial light near the mess hall, photographs and personal effects tucked into corners of the crew quarters I passed. The crew itself numbered only 14, far smaller than I expected for a vessel of its capability, and each of them greeted me with the same easy, unbothered friendliness that Captain Cole had shown during our first meeting. I met Grace Bennett, the ship's tactical officer, during my second day aboard, a woman with a quick, sharp sense of humor, who spent most of our first conversation asking me detailed questions about Threll migratory biology, rather than discussing the war at all. I met Lucas Hale, the chief engineer, a quiet man who showed me, with obvious pride, the propulsion systems that had confused our own sensor analysts so thoroughly, though his explanations remained mostly incomprehensible to me, despite his patient effort. I met Henry Doyle and Olivia Marsh, both weapons specialists, who treated the enormous engagement looming ahead of us with a casual professionalism that I found simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. It was Grace Bennett who explained to me, during a quiet moment in the observation lounge 2 days before the fleet was scheduled to move on Halvorn, why the crew seemed so calm despite the scale of what was coming. "We have done bigger," she told me, not boastfully, simply as a statement of fact. "This is not the kind of fight that keeps any of us up at night. What keeps us up at night is knowing that once this is over, your people are going to look at us differently, and there is nothing we can do about that. That part never gets easier, no matter how many times we do this." I asked her what she meant, and she explained, with a patience that surprised me, that this was not the first time in human history that they had answered a call like this one. There had been other conflicts, other alliances that had reached out in desperation, and in every case, once the immediate threat had been resolved, the relationship between humanity and those they had helped had grown complicated, tinged with a gratitude that could never quite separate itself from fear. "People always say they just want the fighting to stop," she said, "and they mean it, right up until they see what stopping it actually looks like. Then they start wondering what happens if we ever decide to stop something they care about." I did not have an answer for her, and I found myself thinking about her words often over the following days, as the Coalition fleet, reinforced now by 3 additional cruisers and accompanied by the Halcyon, moved toward the Halvorn system to intercept the massive Dominion buildup before it could advance further into Coalition territory. The engagement at Halvorn began at what the Coalition called First Light, though there was no true daylight in the void between systems, only the arbitrary designation assigned by fleet scheduling. I stood on the Halcyon's bridge, a small, efficiently designed space that bore little resemblance to the sprawling command centers aboard Coalition vessels, and watched as the sensor displays filled with the overwhelming mass of the approaching Dominion fleet. 217 vessels, Grace Bennett confirmed, reading from her console without any visible alarm in her voice. Formation suggests they have adapted their approach since the depot engagement. Wider dispersal, less reliance on synchronized movement. Looks like they learned something from watching us work. Captain Cole, seated in the command chair at the center of the bridge, studied the tactical display for a long moment before responding, and I noticed a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of focus that had not been present during our earlier conversations. "Good," he said. "That means they are taking this seriously. That will save time." The Coalition fleet held position at the rear of the formation, per Captain Cole's explicit instructions, a decision that Admiral Vale had accepted only after considerable discussion, uncomfortable with the idea of allowing a single vessel to lead an engagement of this magnitude, regardless of what had happened at the depot. I understood, watching the tactical display fill with the overwhelming numbers arrayed against us, why the Admiral had hesitated, and I understood, just as clearly, why Captain Cole had insisted regardless. "This is not going to look like the depot," he said, addressing the bridge crew and, by extension, the Coalition officers monitoring the engagement remotely. "They have adapted, which means we adapt too. Lucas, I need full power to the forward array the moment we engage. Olivia, Henry, focus on their command vessels first, the ones broadcasting the coordination signals. If we can disrupt the hive coordination early, the rest of this becomes considerably easier." I watched the crew move through their preparations with a calm efficiency that reminded me, oddly, of the migratory preparations of my own people before a long journey, each individual completing their role without wasted motion or unnecessary conversation, trusting entirely in the competence of those around them. There was no shouting, no visible tension, only the quiet hum of a crew that had clearly rehearsed this exact scenario more times than any of them cared to count. "So, the Dominion fleet opened the engagement at a range that would have been considered reckless by Coalition standards, a testament to how thoroughly they had revised their tactics after the depot engagement. Rather than approaching in a tight, coordinated formation, they spread across a wide arc, attempting to surround the Halcyon from multiple angles simultaneously, a strategy clearly designed to prevent the kind of predictive evasion that had defeated their forces so completely just days earlier. I felt the ship shudder beneath me as the first waves of concentrated fire struck the shields, a sensation unlike anything I had experienced aboard Coalition vessels, less a violent impact, and more a deep, resonant pressure that seemed to pass through the entire hull, rather than simply striking its surface. Grace Bennett called out shield percentages in a steady, unhurried voice, and I noticed that even as the numbers dropped, none of the crew showed any visible concern. Captain Cole issued commands with the same measured tone he had used throughout our earlier conversations, adjusting the ship's trajectory in response to the widened Dominion formation, and I watched on the tactical display as the Halcyon began weaving through the surrounding fleet in a pattern that seemed, at first, almost random, before I realized it was systematically isolating individual Dominion command vessels from the support of the wider formation. The battle that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than the brief engagement at the depot, and I understood, watching it unfold, that this was not simply a larger version of the same fight. This was a genuine contest, one where the Dominion's adapted tactics forced real effort from the Halcyon's crew, where victory was not a foregone conclusion, delivered with casual ease, but something earned through sustained, focused effort against an opponent that had, for the first time, truly learned from its previous failure. I watched Henry Doyle and Olivia Marsh work in a coordinated rhythm that reminded me of skilled musicians rather than soldiers, each of them tracking different sections of the Dominion formation, calling out targeting solutions to each other in short, clipped phrases that required no elaboration because each of them already understood exactly what the other meant. I watched Lucas Hale monitor the ship's systems with an intensity that never once slipped into panic, even as warning indicators flashed across sections of his console that I did not fully understand, but which clearly represented genuine strain on the vessel's capabilities. And I watched Captain Cole, throughout all of it, remain exactly as calm as he had been during our very first conversation in the briefing room, issuing corrections and adjustments with the same unhurried precision, even as the battle around us grew more chaotic and the numbers on the tactical display shifted with increasing violence. It was nearly 90 minutes into the engagement when I noticed something change in the Dominion fleet's behavior, a hesitation in their coordinated movements that had not been present at the start of the battle. Grace Bennett noticed it at the same moment I did, and called it out to the rest of the bridge with the first hint of genuine satisfaction I had heard in her voice throughout the engagement. "Their coordination is breaking down," she said. "We have taken out enough of their command nodes that the remaining ships are struggling to maintain synchronization. This is where it usually turns." Captain Cole nodded, studying the display for a moment longer before issuing his next set of instructions, and I noticed that his tone, while still calm, carried a new note of finality. "Then let us finish this properly," he said. "Full engagement. Disable, do not destroy, wherever possible, but I want this fleet unable to continue its advance by the time we are done." What followed was the most intense period of the entire battle, and though I will not describe every detail, I will say that watching the Halcyon's crew execute Captain Cole's final orders left me with an understanding of human capability that no historical record or second-hand story could have conveyed. The remaining Dominion vessels, their coordination shattered, began to scatter, some attempting retreat, others continuing to press the attack despite the clear collapse of their unified strategy, and the Halcyon moved through the resulting chaos, with a precision that felt less like combat and more like the careful, deliberate work of dismantling a structure piece by piece. By the time the engagement concluded, the Dominion fleet that had numbered 217 vessels at the start of the battle had been reduced to a scattered, disorganized remnant of perhaps 60 ships attempting a chaotic retreat toward Dominion territory. The Halcyon had sustained damage, visible strain evident in Lucas Hale's exhausted expression, and the warning indicators still flickering across several of the ship's systems, but it remained fully operational, and not a single member of its crew had been seriously harmed. I stood on the bridge in the aftermath, watching the tactical display slowly clear as the retreating Dominion forces moved beyond effective sensor range, and I felt an exhaustion unlike any I had experienced before, though I had done nothing during the engagement except watch. Captain Cole rose from the command chair, rolling his shoulders in a gesture of simple physical relief, and turned to address the bridge crew with a brief, tired smile. "Good work," he said, and though the words were simple, I understood, watching the crew's quiet, satisfied reactions, that this brief acknowledgement carried more weight among them than any elaborate speech could have. Admiral Vale's voice came through the comm channel moments later, and I heard, even through the distortion of the transmission, the genuine shock in his tone as he confirmed the scale of what had just occurred. 200 vessels, he said, more to himself than to anyone listening, reduced to a disorganized retreat in under 2 hours. "Captain Cole, I do not know how the Council will express this properly, but on behalf of every world that fleet was moving toward, thank you." Captain Cole's response was brief, delivered with the same measured tone he had used throughout the engagement, though I noticed, standing beside him, a flicker of something more complicated behind his eyes as he spoke. "Do not thank me yet, Admiral," he said. "This was the fleet the Dominion was willing to lose testing our capabilities. What comes next, once their command structure finishes processing exactly what happened here today, is going to be considerably more difficult to predict." News of the Halvorn engagement spread through the coalition faster than any story I had witnessed in my career, faster even than the destruction of the Varan colonies had spread months earlier, though this time the reaction carried a very different texture. Where the news of our early losses had brought grief and fear, the reports from Halvorn brought something closer to disbelief. Entire crews across the fleet gathering around communication terminals to hear the confirmed casualty figures read aloud, as though repetition might make the numbers feel more real. I remained aboard the Halcyon during the days that followed, partly because Commander Solon had requested I continue serving as liaison, and partly because I found myself reluctant to leave, curious about what I might learn if I stayed close to the crew during this quieter period between engagements. The ship required repairs after the battle, minor but numerous, and I spent several days simply observing the crew work, struck by how ordinary their conversations became once the immediate danger had passed. It was during one of these quiet periods that Captain Cole found me in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars, while the rest of the crew worked through their repair schedules elsewhere in the ship. He sat across from me without invitation, the same easy familiarity he had shown from our very first meeting, and for a while neither of us spoke, simply watching the slow drift of distant starlight through the viewport. "You have questions," he said eventually. Not quite a question itself, more an observation offered to open a conversation he seemed to sense I had been hesitant to start. I admitted that I did, and after a moment of consideration, I asked him the question that had been sitting with me since our first conversation in the weapons control room, weeks earlier. I asked him what it truly cost his people to answer calls like this one, to carry the kind of capability I had now witnessed firsthand, and to choose, every time, how much of it to reveal. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something closer to genuine weariness than the calm professionalism he typically maintained. "It costs us the ability to simply exist quietly," he said. "That is the honest answer, Talus. Every time we answer a call like this one, every time we step onto a battlefield and the galaxy watches what we are capable of, it changes how we are treated afterward. Gratitude fades. Fear does not. And once fear settles into how an entire alliance of species views you, it becomes very difficult for anyone to see you as anything else again, no matter how many times you prove that restraint, not violence, has always been the actual point." I asked him whether that bothered him, whether the fear that inevitably followed humanity's involvement in a conflict felt unfair, given the sacrifice involved in ending it. He considered the question carefully before responding, and his answer surprised me with its honesty. "It used to bother me more than it does now," he admitted. "I have had a long time to make peace with the fact that fear is simply a rational response to what we are capable of, whether or not that fear is fair. What bothers me more, honestly, is watching my own people forget why the restraint matters in the first place. That is the real danger, not the fear of others, but the temptation, every single time, to simply skip past the restraint because it would be faster, easier, more efficient. The treaty exists because somewhere along the way, my people learned that efficiency without restraint is exactly how threats like the one we ended generations ago come into being in the first place." I asked him then about the ancient conflict he had mentioned during our earlier conversation, the one that had led to humanity's isolation in the first place, curious whether he was willing to share more detail than he had before. He hesitated, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like genuine reluctance. "I can tell you the shape of it," he said eventually, "though I cannot tell you everything. Some of it is not entirely mine to share. There was a power, generations before any of your species had built a fleet capable of leaving your own solar systems, that believed conquest was simply the correct order of the universe. It did not negotiate. It did not accept surrender. It simply expanded, consuming resources and populations with the same patient inevitability the Skarn Dominion has shown your people over the last decade." He paused, studying the stars beyond the viewport for a long moment before continuing. "We fought it for nearly 30 years, he said, losing more than we ever admit to outsiders, even now, and when we finally understood that negotiation would never work, that mercy would never be returned in kind, we made a choice that ended the threat permanently, not through numbers, because we did not have the numbers. Through a level of focused, sustained commitment that our own allies at the time found more frightening than the threat we had just ended. Several of them quietly withdrew from contact with us within a decade of that victory. The treaty that isolated us afterward was, in many ways, simply the formalization of a distance that had already begun forming naturally. I asked him whether he believed the coalition would do the same, once the Skarn Dominion was finally defeated, whether gratitude would eventually curdle into the same quiet, fearful distance his people had experienced before. He looked at me then, and his expression softened into something that felt, for the first time since I had met him, genuinely sad rather than simply weary. "I do not know," he admitted. "Every alliance handles it differently. Some manage to hold on to the gratitude longer than others, but I have learned not to expect otherwise, Talus. It is easier that way, for everyone involved. We do the work because the work needs doing, not because we expect the galaxy to love us for it afterward." I did not have a response to that, and we sat together in silence for a while longer, watching the stars, until Grace Bennett's voice came through the ship's internal comm, informing Captain Cole that the repair schedule had been completed ahead of projections, and that Fleet Command was requesting an updated briefing on next steps. That briefing, held the following day aboard the Avalane Spire, brought news that confirmed exactly the concern Captain Cole had voiced after the Halvorn engagement. Coalition intelligence reported that the Skarn Dominion's command structure, rather than retreating in the wake of such a decisive defeat, had begun a massive mobilization effort across their entire territory, redirecting production and resources on a scale that suggested a single, unified response to what had happened at Halvorn. Admiral Vale presented the intelligence with visible concern, describing a buildup that dwarfed even the 200-vessel fleet that had been defeated days earlier. "Early estimates suggest a force approaching 400 vessels," he said, along with reports of previously unseen weapons platforms being deployed from deeper within Dominion territory, technology our intelligence networks have never encountered before. I watched Captain Cole receive this news with the same measured calm he had shown throughout every previous briefing, though I noticed, sitting beside Commander Solon during the session, a subtle shift in his posture, a stillness that suggested careful, focused calculation rather than simple attentiveness. "This is the response I expected," he said once Admiral Vale finished his summary. "They lost a significant fleet testing our capabilities, and now their command structure has concluded that the correct response is overwhelming force rather than caution. That is, unfortunately, a very common mistake among threats that have relied on numerical superiority for a long time. It rarely occurs to them that numbers were never truly the deciding factor to begin with." Admiral Vale asked, carefully, whether Captain Cole believed the Halcyon alone could withstand a force of that magnitude, particularly given the introduction of unfamiliar Dominion technology into the equation. Captain Cole was quiet for a moment before answering, and when he did, his response carried a weight that settled over the entire briefing room. "I do not intend to find out alone," he said. "It is time my government understood the true scale of what this conflict actually requires. I will be requesting additional support." The room fell silent at this announcement, and I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the ship's climate controls. Throughout every previous conversation, every engagement, Captain Cole had approached this war as though a single vessel was, genuinely, a sufficient answer to whatever the Skarn Dominion could bring against us. Hearing him acknowledge, for the first time, that this assumption might no longer hold true, carried an implication that none of us in that room were fully prepared to process. Counselor Yeshin Dara, present for this briefing as the Ashkar delegation's representative, asked the question that I suspect every coalition officer present had been thinking but had not yet voiced. If a single human vessel required reinforcement to face this threat, she asked, what exactly did that mean about the true scale of what the coalition itself might be facing? Captain Cole's answer, delivered with the same unhurried calm that had defined every interaction I had witnessed since his arrival, offered no comfort, though it offered something perhaps more valuable, an honesty that the coalition desperately needed after years of uncertain, incomplete information. "It means the Skarn Dominion has decided this conflict is worth escalating, to a scale they have likely never used against any opponent before," he said. "And it means my government's original assessment, that a single vessel would be sufficient to evaluate and stabilize this situation, was based on incomplete information about how seriously the Dominion would take their first defeat." That happens sometimes. Threats do not always behave the way our models predict, and when they surprise us, the correct response is not stubbornness. It is adaptation. He paused, glancing around the room at the gathered coalition officers, each of them watching him with expressions ranging from fear to fragile hope, before continuing. "I will not pretend this next engagement will be simple," he said, "but I want every person in this room to understand something clearly. What is coming is not a sign that my earlier assessment was wrong about what my people are capable of. It is a sign that the Dominion has finally understood the stakes involved, and has chosen, as most desperate powers eventually do, to escalate rather than reconsider. That choice, more than any weapon or fleet size, is usually the beginning of the end for a threat like this one, whether they realize it yet or not." I did not fully understand what he meant by that until several days later, when the first additional human vessels began arriving at the coordinates the Halcyon had transmitted, and I finally understood that everything I had witnessed so far, the depot engagement, the battle at Halvorn, the quiet, restrained power I had come to associate with Captain Cole and his small crew, had truly only ever been the very beginning of what humanity was capable of bringing to this war. The arrival of the human reinforcements did not resemble anything the Coalition fleet had prepared for, despite days of speculation and preparation following Captain Cole's announcement. I stood once again on the Aveline Spire's observation deck, alongside Commander Solon and a crowd of off-duty crew members that had grown even larger than the gathering that had witnessed the Halcyon's original arrival, and watched the sensor displays begin registering new contacts crossing the treaty boundary, in a pattern that built slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Ovrin Tass, still serving as our primary sensor officer, called out the count as it climbed, his voice growing tighter with each update. 6 vessels, he said, then paused as new readings appeared. 11, 19. The numbers kept climbing, and I noticed Commander Solon's expression shift from cautious anticipation into something closer to quiet awe as the count passed 30, then 40, before finally stabilizing at a number that Ovrin read aloud in a hushed voice, as though speaking too loudly might somehow cause it to change. 47 vessels, confirmed, and holding position at the rally point. I asked Commander Solon whether this represented a significant commitment by human standards, curious whether 47 vessels was itself an extraordinary mobilization or simply a modest escalation from a much larger reserve of capability. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the tactical display with an expression I had not seen from her before, something that mixed relief with a deeper, more complicated unease. 47 vessels of that classification, she said eventually, represents more firepower than the entire Coalition fleet has assembled in a single location during this entire war. And I promise you, Talus, this is still not the full extent of what my people are capable of committing, if the situation required it. The scale of that statement settled over me slowly, and I found myself thinking again of Grace Bennett's words from days earlier, about the complicated weight of gratitude tinged with fear that inevitably followed humanity's involvement in a conflict. Watching those 47 vessels hold position, silent and dark against the stars just as the Halcyon had been during its own arrival, I understood, for the first time truly, why that fear existed, and why it would likely never fully disappear, no matter how thoroughly humanity proved its restraint. The combined fleet, coalition, and human forces operating under a coordinated command structure that Captain Cole helped establish over the following days, moved to intercept the Skarn Dominion's massive mobilization near a system called Threndor Reach, a strategic junction that controlled access to nearly half of the Coalition's remaining core territory. Intelligence estimates had grown even more concerning in the days leading up to the engagement, confirming a Dominion force that had swelled past 400 vessels, supplemented by the unfamiliar weapons platforms that our own analysts had struggled to classify. I remained aboard the Halcyon for this engagement, though Captain Cole informed me, with evident concern for my safety, that I was welcome to transfer back to the Aveline Spire if I preferred to observe from a greater distance. I declined, and I do not fully regret that decision, though what followed remains, even now, difficult to fully put into words. The engagement at Threndor Reach unfolded across nearly 6 hours, the longest sustained battle I had witnessed throughout the entire conflict, and unlike the previous engagements, this one carried genuine uncertainty from its opening moments. The Dominion's new weapons platforms, Massive vessels bristling with technology that our own scanners struggled to fully analyze even as they fired, proved capable of inflicting damage that neither the depot engagement nor the battle at Halvorn had prepared us for. I watched, from the Halcyon's bridge, as two of the smaller human vessels sustained serious damage within the first hour of fighting, their crews working desperately to maintain shields against concentrated fire that seemed designed specifically to counter the tactics that had proven so effective in earlier engagements. Grace Bennett, monitoring the wider battle alongside her own console, called out updates with a tension I had not heard in her voice during any previous engagement, and I understood, watching her focused, careful expression, that this battle was testing something in the human fleet that the earlier engagements had not. Captain Cole coordinated the wider human response with the same measured calm he had maintained throughout every previous conversation, though I noticed the pace of his commands quicken, a subtle urgency entering his voice as the battle wore on, and the Dominion's new capabilities continued to inflict damage across the combined fleet. Coalition vessels, positioned at the flanks under Admiral Vale's direct command, provided support wherever possible, and I found myself, for the first time, watching a battle where human and coalition forces truly fought as a single unified force, rather than simply witnessing human capability from a cautious distance. It was nearly 4 hours into the engagement when the tide began, gradually and then with increasing speed, to turn. Lucas Hale, working alongside the Halcyon's weapons crew, managed to identify a critical vulnerability in the Dominion's new weapons platforms, a power distribution flaw that, once exploited, caused the massive vessels to lose their most dangerous capabilities entirely. I watched him relay this information across the combined fleet's communication network, and within minutes, human and coalition vessels alike began adjusting their targeting priorities, focusing concentrated fire on the specific systems Lucas had identified. The Dominion's command structure, already strained by the loss of coordination that had plagued their forces since the Halvorn engagement, seemed unable to adapt quickly enough to this new vulnerability, and I watched, over the following 2 hours, as their massive fleet's cohesion began to fracture in ways that reminded me, uncomfortably, of watching a structure collapse under stress that had finally exceeded its design limits. By the time the engagement concluded, the Skarn Dominion's mobilized force had suffered losses so severe that the surviving vessels, numbering perhaps 80 out of the original 400, retreated in a disorganized scramble that bore no resemblance to the methodical, synchronized movements that had characterized every previous Dominion engagement I had witnessed. The combined coalition and human fleet had sustained losses of its own, more significant than any previous engagement involving human forces, though far lighter than the coalition had suffered during any comparable battle fought without human assistance. I stood on the Halcyon's bridge in the aftermath, watching the crew work through the exhausted, careful process of assessing damage and confirming the status of every vessel in the combined fleet, and I felt, for the first time since the beginning of this war, something that resembled genuine hope rather than desperate, fragile optimism. 3 days after the Threndor Reach engagement, Coalition intelligence intercepted a transmission from Skarn Dominion Command that none of us, not even Captain Cole, had fully anticipated. Admiral Vale called an emergency session to review the intercepted communication, and I watched, alongside Commander Solon and the assembled coalition leadership, as the translated message played across the briefing room's central display. The transmission, addressed directly to Coalition Command rather than broadcast openly as previous Dominion communications had been, requested what their translated language described, awkwardly but unmistakably, as a cessation of hostilities pending formal negotiation. It was, as far as any coalition historian present could confirm, the first such request the Skarn Dominion had ever made in the entire history of its expansion. The briefing room fell into stunned silence as the implications settled over everyone present. Counselor Yeshindara was the first to speak, her voice carrying a disbelief that mirrored what I suspect every coalition officer in that room was feeling. "In all the years this war has been fought," she said, "the Dominion has never once requested negotiation. Not after our greatest victories, not even when their own forces have suffered significant losses. What has changed?" Captain Cole, seated near the back of the room, answered the question before Admiral Vale could offer his own assessment, and his response, delivered with the same measured honesty he had shown throughout every previous briefing, offered a perspective that reframed the entire conflict for everyone listening. "What has changed," he said, "is that for the first time, the Dominion's command structure has been forced to consider the possibility of a cost it cannot simply absorb and continue expanding regardless. Every previous engagement against coalition forces, however costly, remained within a range their strategic calculations could tolerate. Threndor Reach was different. They committed their most advanced technology and their largest assembled fleet, and lost the majority of it in a single engagement. That is not a cost their expansion model was built to survive repeatedly. Threats like this one do not stop because they suddenly develop a conscience. They stop when continuing becomes mathematically unsustainable. And I believe, for the first time, the Dominion's command structure has finally done that math correctly." Admiral Vale asked, carefully, whether Captain Cole believed the negotiation request was genuine, or whether it represented simply a tactical pause designed to allow the Dominion time to rebuild their forces before resuming the conflict on more favorable terms. Captain Cole considered the question for a long moment before answering, and his response carried the same careful honesty that had characterized every conversation I had shared with him since his arrival. "I do not know yet," he admitted. "It may be genuine, it may be a delay tactic. The only way to find out is to engage in the negotiation carefully, while maintaining enough strength to respond immediately if it proves to be the latter. That is not a decision I can make for the Coalition Council. But I would recommend caution, paired with genuine willingness to listen. Wars like this one rarely end cleanly, but they have to end somehow, and a negotiated peace, however imperfect, is almost always preferable to the alternative." The Coalition Council spent the following weeks engaged in careful, cautious negotiation with Skarn Dominion representatives, a process I observed only from a distance, occupied instead with returning to my regular duties aboard the Aveline Spire, while the diplomatic proceedings unfolded through official channels. Commander Solon kept me informed of the general progress, though the details remained largely confidential even to junior officers like myself. What I do know, because it became common knowledge across the fleet within days of its confirmation, was that the negotiations ultimately produced a ceasefire, tentative and heavily monitored, but real, the first genuine pause in hostilities the Coalition had experienced since the Skarn Dominion's expansion into our territory had begun years earlier. Whether that ceasefire would hold permanently remained an open question that no one, not even Captain Cole, was willing to answer with certainty. But for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, the Coalition's worlds could sleep without the immediate fear that tomorrow might bring news of another silent colony, another erased settlement, another name added to a list that had grown far too long. 6 months passed between the signing of the ceasefire and the day I finally sat down to write my own account of everything I had witnessed, and in that time, the galaxy I had grown up in continued to change, in ways that none of the historical records I once studied could have prepared me for. The Skarn Dominion's negotiated peace held, imperfect and closely monitored, but real, and the Coalition worlds that had spent years bracing for the next devastating attack slowly, cautiously, began to believe that the worst of the war truly had ended. I returned to my regular duties aboard the Aveline Spire once the immediate crisis had passed, though I found myself, in the months that followed, unable to fully settle back into the routine I had known before Captain Cole's arrival. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in the balance of power across the galaxy, but in how every species within the Coalition understood its place within a wider community that now included, whether anyone was entirely comfortable with it or not, a species capable of the kind of restrained, devastating power I had witnessed firsthand. Commander Solon remained aboard the Aveline Spire as well, and I spent many evenings during those months sitting with her in the officers' mess, discussing everything we had witnessed and trying, together, to make sense of what it truly meant for the future. It was during one of these conversations, nearly 5 months after the ceasefire, that she told me something Captain Cole had shared with her privately, before the Halcyon and its accompanying fleet finally withdrew back across the treaty boundary, returning to whatever quiet existence humanity maintained beyond the borders the rest of the galaxy had once assumed would never be crossed again. "He told me the hardest part was always what came after," she said, turning her cup slowly between her hands, in the same familiar gesture I had come to associate with her most thoughtful moments. Not the fighting. Not even the decision to reveal what his people are truly capable of. The hardest part is always watching the relationship change afterward. Watching gratitude slowly transform into something more cautious, more distant, no matter how much good the intervention actually accomplished. I asked her whether she believed that transformation had already begun within the coalition, whether the fear I had sensed growing alongside the relief in the months following the ceasefire represented the beginning of the same quiet withdrawal that had apparently followed every previous instance of humanity answering a desperate call for help. She considered the question carefully, the way she considered every question that mattered to her, before answering honestly. "I think it has already begun," she admitted. Not from malice, not from ingratitude, but simply because it is difficult for any species to feel entirely comfortable existing alongside a power capable of what we witnessed at Threndor Reach. Fear like that does not require cruelty to take root. It only requires understanding, clearly and completely, exactly what another power could choose to do if it ever decided the restraint was no longer worth maintaining. I thought about her words often in the months that followed, particularly as I began compiling my own account of everything I had witnessed, determined that the true story, complicated and layered as it truly was, should exist somewhere beyond the increasingly exaggerated rumors that continued to circulate throughout Coalition space. I thought about Captain Cole's quiet admission, during our conversation in the Halcyon's observation lounge, that he had made peace with the fear that inevitably followed his people's involvement in a conflict, that he understood it as simply a rational response, rather than an injustice to resent. I thought, too, about Grace Bennett's words from that same period, about watching an alliance's gratitude fade, while the fear that replaced it never quite disappeared, and I found myself wondering, as I suspect every officer who had witnessed those months of conflict wondered in their own private moments, whether the coalition would prove any different from whatever powers had turned away from humanity in the past. I do not have a certain answer to that question, even now, and I suspect I never will. What I can say, with complete honesty, is that the galaxy I live in today bears little resemblance to the one I grew up believing I understood. The old stories, the ones that spoke of sleepers who should never be woken, the ones that reduced an entire species to a cautionary myth, meant to teach children the value of never testing boundaries better left unexplored. Those stories no longer hold the same shape they once did. In their place, a new understanding has slowly taken root across Coalition space, one built not on second-hand rumor and redacted historical records, but on the direct, witnessed experience of thousands of Coalition citizens who watched, with their own eyes, exactly what happened when the galaxy's greatest myth finally stepped onto a battlefield that desperately needed saving. It is a more complicated understanding than the old myth ever allowed for. Neither the simple monster of childhood cautionary tales, nor the uncomplicated hero that gratitude alone might have painted in the immediate aftermath of Threndor Reach. What I witnessed, across those difficult months, was a species that carried an almost unbearable weight of capability, and chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to shoulder that weight with restraint rather than indulgence. I witnessed a captain who spoke of ending threats with the same tired honesty he might have used to describe any difficult, necessary task, never once treating the power at his disposal as something to be celebrated rather than carefully, thoughtfully managed. I witnessed a crew who fought not for glory or conquest, but because the work needed doing, and who understood, better than any of us initially did, that the true cost of what they offered was never going to be measured only in the resources or lives spent during the fighting itself, but in every quiet, complicated interaction that would follow for years afterward. Councillor Yeshin Dara, in a speech delivered before the full Coalition Council, nearly a year after the ceasefire was first signed, offered words that I believe captured this new understanding, better than anything I could write myself. "We called upon a myth to save us," she said, and what answered was not the monster our old stories warned us about, nor the simple hero our desperation hoped for. What answered was something far more complicated, a species that understands the true weight of power well enough to fear using it themselves, even as the rest of us struggle to feel anything but relief and caution in equal measure. Perhaps that is the most honest kind of ally any of us could have asked for. I think of Captain Cole often, even now, and I wonder sometimes what became of him after the Halcyon withdrew back across the treaty boundary, back into whatever quiet existence his people maintain beyond the borders. The rest of the galaxy still hesitates to cross uninvited. I wonder whether he carries the weight of Threndor Reach the way he seemed to carry every previous engagement, with the same tired, careful honesty, understanding fully what his restraint cost him personally, even as it saved everything the rest of us held dear. The Coalition worlds are safer now than they have been and longer than I can clearly remember, and for that, I remain genuinely, deeply grateful, whatever complicated feelings accompany that gratitude. The old myth, the story of sleepers who should never be woken, has given way to something truer and considerably harder to summarize in a single cautionary phrase. Humanity is not the monster the old stories warned against, and it is not the simple, uncomplicated hero that desperate hope might have preferred either. It is something else entirely, a civilization that treats devastating war as an absolute last resort, precisely because it understands, with a clarity few other species have ever needed to develop, exactly how effective it becomes the moment restraint is finally set aside. That understanding, more than any weapon or fleet size, is what truly changed the shape of the galaxy during those difficult months, and it is the understanding I have tried, as honestly as I know how, to pass on through this account. The myth is gone now, replaced by something far more complicated and far more true. The galaxy remembers, with equal measure of gratitude and quiet unease, the moment a single human warship crossed an ancient boundary to answer a desperate call, and in doing so, revealed to all of us exactly what had been sleeping beyond that boundary all along. Not a monster, not simply a hero, something the old stories never quite had the words to properly describe, a shield the galaxy did not know it needed, wielded by a species that understood, better than any of us, the true and terrible cost of ever needing to use it at all.